how restoring the religious roots of our spiritual practices can heal us. Here's the book. Liz, welcome to the show.
Great, thanks. And I asked Anna to hold up her copy of the book because she has one that looks prettier than my copy of the book. So that's awesome. Thank you.
I know that life as a writer where you have like 18 different drafts with sticky notes. So
Totally.
everybody can buy the book wherever books are sold when it comes out. I really enjoyed it. Liz, why don't you just kind of introduce yourself? You're an interesting person. You have a Substack called Religion Reimagined. I think you're interesting because you don't identify or practice any particular religious tradition, and yet you're very interested in it. Obviously, I mean, you teach religious studies. So how did you get into that?
How did I get into religious studies as teaching? Yeah, because the Substack is pretty new, but I'm having a lot of fun there. So I got into religious studies by mistake, I think. So I didn't study religion in college. I was a gov major and human rights major, and I went to DC after college and sort of did social justice, human rights-y kind of work. And then I made my way through doing that for a little bit to an organization called Catholics for Choice, which is a pro-choice, pro-maternal health, pro-contraception, access to contraception Catholic organization. So I am baptized Catholic. I was not raised Catholic. I was raised Protestant, but then I sort of don't identify as Christian really either, or Protestant either. I left, quote unquote, left the church when I didn't have to go to Sunday school anymore, when it was my decision. But that to work for the organization, I had to sort of kind of reclaim a little bit of a Catholic identity. And I have to say that for me was such an important job. Like the then president, Frances Kissling, who is amazing, really mentored me and kind of took me under her wing and gave me a lot of responsibility, probably more than I warranted or deserved, and let me do all this really cool research. And I think I went into that job being like, religion is like a problem in the world to be solved. Like I saw it as like an obstacle to abortion rights and contraception access, and in Latin America particularly, which is where the country, that was like the region I had been working in at the time. And then I kind of came out of that job being like, no, this is a resource. Like there are already faith communities working within their traditions, and like in terms of like using their traditions for progressive resources. And I was sort of, naive to think that like, just because I'm not religious doesn't mean there's not resources there. And that's what brought me to graduate school in religion. And actually, I also should confess, I did not just apply to graduate school in religion. I applied to schools of public health. I applied to law schools, and I applied to religion schools all at the same time. I applied to 18 schools, and I was like, okay, let's see. And then when I had everything in front of me, I decided to defer law school at Chicago and start just a master's, and just a toe in the water in religion at the Divinity School at Chicago. And then I just was kind of hooked. Like the more I did, I was like, this is really interesting. I'm in this kind of a weirdo in religious studies because I sat between a couple different major branches. Chicago at the time was organized in sort of constructive studies, people who did ethics and theology. I was like super interested in that, but I'm like, well, I'm not a theologian. I'm not an ethicist. And then people who did like comparative religion, history religion, like kind of more like anthropologists, I was a little bit drawn to that. I was like, oh, I'm interested in that, but I'm not just that. I'm also interested in these normative questions. So I sat somewhere in the middle, and they kind of allowed me to do that. And then I kind of very quickly became a comparativist because I didn't want to identify as a Catholic moral theologian. So I did a lot of work at Islam and Arabic and Persian in grad school. And that was like my first sort of like wave of religion. And now I am where I am now, which is, again, very different than when I was in grad school. I think I left grad school thinking you can study religion from some scientific place of unbiased, like as an observer, right? I'm just describing what's going on. I'm not doing religion, right? I'm just observing, describing, explaining. I'm not actually myself doing prescriptive work, normative work. And I think in the last couple years, I've realized that that's not really true, that I'm also interested in doing that constructive work. And that's partly what this last book is, Beyond Wellness, sort of like, all right, like I can do the deconstructive work. That's what my last book was. My last book was called Stealing My Religion. So it's sort of like, okay, we're borrowing these practices. People like me who are non-religious affiliated, we're really interested in this stuff. We like to try them on. Is there some problems with that? Well, how are we interacting with systems of inequity? It's a little like Yuck Your Yum book, I call it, like make you feel a little guilty. I'm okay with that. I want you to be a little confused and concerned. But this new book, Beyond Wellness, is like, okay, fine, all that, sure. But then how do we engage these religious traditions? Because I don't want people just to like retreat from them and think that they're all bad and unhelpful, because they are helpful. I find them helpful as conversation partners, right? but only if you have a deeper conversation than just trying other practices. So I've had a kind of weird trajectory. And then, so this book, Beyond Wellness, and I think the Substack too, is me really putting on my big girl pants and trying to like really speak if I be really vulnerable about like where I feel about my own sort of spirituality and my own religion as someone who's like really kind of uncomfortable with those labels for myself, but also deeply interested in them.
I really appreciate you sharing that, and I really appreciate your perspective on your Substack. Walker Percy is one of my favorite writers, and he has that quote about like 90% of people identify as religious, 10% as atheists, not a single percentage point for a seeker. And I see
Yeah.
that kind of in your writing, that genuine curiosity, without necessarily having an answer to all those big questions. So I appreciate that
Oh,
about you.
yeah. I have like no answers. And I have to say, in the world of religious studies, the idea of spirituality itself is sort of like a little bit problematic. We sort of see that term we sort of think of as like, oh, that's just a term people use to talk about the religion that they like and that they want to sort of like adopt. So like even that distinction between religion and spirituality is kind of hard for me. So maybe I'm like a religious seeker actually, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to convert. I'm not like looking for a tradition to like put myself into, but like I think I'm becoming more comfortable calling myself what other people would see as like sort of a seeker, like not in a new age spiritualism sort of like 1970s way, but in what I see as sort of a little bit, I think, I don't know if it's a movement or what it is, but I see it very common. It's very common within my students, but I also see it within my friend group. So I'm what am I? Gen X? Yeah. So like people my age, I'm 50, 52, like who are also like not religious, maybe raised kind of secular, agnostic is too strong of a term, but sort of realizing that there's something missing from their wellness self-care routines or whatever, or just like general like liberal philosophy or enlightenment not going so great, capitalism's not going so great. So yeah, I think that that's like a place I'm trying to grow into a little bit with other, like in conversation. The Substack is me doing it in conversation with other people.
Well, I loved your book. A lot of academic books can be, not very fun reading, but this book is actually a romp. It's funny, it's entertaining, you'll learn stuff. You go through various wellness trends, sound baths, yoga, spiritual
Yeah.
eating, ayahuasca, the 12 steps, meditation that you're drawn to as a Western American woman. And you kind of help people understand some of the history and the religious influences behind those trends, and
Yeah.
I hope that those trends will become more meaningful to them if they go a little bit deeper. So I kind
Yeah.
of wanted to start with the yoga chapter because I know a lot of people who listen to Inner Immigrate, the focus of my Substack, annakeating.substack.com, is making sense of the weird moment that we're living through politically and also trying to find joy in the midst of it.
Yeah.
So I'm sure a lot of people do yoga looking for that kind of break
Yeah.
from the news to reconnect
Yeah.
with their body. But maybe you could speak to like some of the religious meaning behind the postures that people do in their yoga classes.
Yeah. And I think the way you characterize the book is really good. Like these are practices, they're not just the ones that I'm probably drawn to as a Western white woman. They're the ones that are like sold to me, right? They're the ones that are presented to me. They're the ones that are very mainstream. And obviously yoga is probably the most mainstream. Although probably a lot of people would, disagree with the idea that yoga is all religious or spiritual, right? Because it's not for them. And that's part of the history that I like talk about in the chapter, because that's like we got there through a particular history. And it's totally right to say that for a lot of, say, Americans who practice yoga, they don't think of their yoga as devotional anyway. But that has to do a little bit with the rebranding that happens, right? So the rebranding, well, first of all, the sort of like yoga itself is this larger sort of system. So first of all, it's the like promotion of just the postures and the asana, but then also it's a promotion of those things themselves as about longevity or maybe beauty or health instead of larger and more broader understandings of well-being. I mean, the book is called Beyond Wellness because I think wellness is too low of a bar. Like that's like not enough. Like my BMI is fine. My muscle tone is great, Like my blood work looks great. It's just not enough. Like that to me that doesn't describe a fully human flourishing life. I'm not trying to live forever. I'm not Brian Johnson, right? So what does it mean to like really think about this? This is a practice. If we think about just the postures, how are they embodied practices meant to do something more than just, make us look good in yoga pants or whatever it is, or help our backs. It does help my back, but what else can it do? So part of that chapter thinks about part of that history in the US and like how it is that someone like me comes to yoga as like, and I have this sort of weird lineage because my mom was a yoga teacher before that was cool. And she learned from one of these women I talk about in the chapter, Lilias Folan, who had a PBS show in the 70s, like, which if you watch PBS in the 70s, you know who Lilias Folan is. She was like, in her leotard with her braid and her Om single on a carpeted, whatever. Very, very important for making yoga seem as American as apple pie. She was girl next door vibes. She herself knew devotional yoga. She had studied it, but that's not what she presented to people. So partly that's like also a story of like, why are we so worried about the religious part of it, the devotional part? Like, I mean, I don't know. I do yoga instead of Pilates. Well, I find Pilates really hard, but I also do yoga instead of Pilates because I think it is different than Pilates, right? I think people are looking for whatever that thing is, that mental piece, that spiritual piece, whatever that deeper piece, that quote unquote ancient wisdom piece. But then we don't really want to dive into what that is really, or we have maybe less opportunities to learn what that is. So that's part of what the history is in that chapter.
I really liked in the chapter where you talked about like the postures teach you things. So orthopraxy is like right practice versus orthodoxy, which is right thinking or right belief.
Yeah.
And that really meshed with me because so I'm an elder millennial, but I grew up in a super Catholic home and Catholics kneel, right? And we bow and we kiss saint statues and crosses. Yeah. And the idea is not that you do those things because you are reverent or because you are devout. You do those postures in order to cultivate.
To become devout.
To cultivate humility, right? Yeah. And so over a lifetime of kneeling, hopefully you learn to have humility or respect.
Yeah.
And so I really liked what you were saying about like the sun salutation and all of those postures, having those elements of trying to, yes, make you healthier and all of this, but also trying to make you more moral in some sense.
So the other sort of thing about me is my PhD is in religious ethics. So I'm always interested in the ethical angle, the moral angle. But what you said is actually like the key. Like, this book is not really an academic book, but there's like a little teaching moment in each chapter. And what you just said is like the teaching moment in this chapter. That's the takeaway from religious studies, that like religion is not just belief. People think when I say, they ask you if you're religious, they think, do you have membership to a church or whatever, or do you follow this set of beliefs? But religion is also something that's embodied and done. And that idea of orthopraxy, doing like right actions. The Catholic examples you gave are great. I used to take a student abroad course to the Camino in northern Spain, where we'd walk the Camino. I'm like, and this physical practice was meant to sort of change the pilgrim. So how does it change you, right? And like the idea that like the beliefs will come after you do the thing, right? So I think that right away is a one way to approach all of the practices in the book, or any sort of spiritual practice that you're dipping into. Like if it's an embodied practice, how is this practice meant to remake me? Do I understand what it's meant to do? And do I want to be remade in that way?
Exactly.
Right? Because like, that's important. I think sometimes we just do stuff. Oh, that sounds, but like, oh, does that line up with my core values, my understanding of flourishing, and so like some of the yoga practices, I talk about some things in detail, right? But they're not exercises in like a fitness sense, right? There's a different chapter about fitness. This chapter is more about like how, when we do things, do they change us? And so, an example I use in that chapter, which I think is the example I use with my students all the time too, because it really makes sense. And if they don't do yoga and they don't understand how maybe yoga could change them, I use the example of masking during COVID, right? And the importance of like what the intention of masking is changes how it affects how it changes you. So I talk in the chapter a little bit, and when I talk to students or talk to other people about this idea, it's a concept of virtue ethics in like the philosophical tradition, but the idea that like you remake yourself because of you do something over and over again, it's a habit. But if you wear a mask, like I had a sixth grader at the time, and I was really clear about messaging to her, like, you're wearing a mask not because we're scared or you're scared. We're wearing a mask because our neighbors are 80. We're wearing a mask because we're going to see grandma and grandpa next week. We're wearing a mask to protect other people in our community. And if you that's your intention when you put on a mask, it's very different than putting on a mask to like a self-preservation, right? You remake yourself in a different way, depending on what sort of values and meaning you attach to that. So I think the question about like what do the physical practices do to you probably depends on the community that you're practicing in, what lineage you're practicing in, how your own understanding of it, because you'll start to imprint those things on yourself, right? Like, is it, sun salutation is really about submission, but is there another way in which you're thinking about the ethics, the yamas and niyamas of yoga? You're interested in those, integrating those into your practice, so it's really also not just like your time on the mat, but then like how you're trying to apply those practices off the mat. It's this funny thing that people always like, a teacher will be like, set an intention when you start the class, right? But like an intention kind of matters, right? A little bit, because you're then thinking about training yourself for that hour, like training yourself, not just your body, but training yourself. And I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about all of these sort of spiritual practices and the power they can have on us.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you come there on the mat to find peace, then the goal is bigger than you. It's also ethical if you're trying to then go give peace to everyone that you interact with that day.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I mean, we should name the fact that we're in a particularly difficult political moment right now. And so I think people are finding, and there's no shame in this, people are finding respite and release on their time on the mat and recharging to do whatever it is that they have to do, whether or not that's like not, for me, it's like not crying in front of my family, or like, switching between being a caretaker and then also like trying to be politically active or being aware and witnessing and sort of like engaged in what's going on in the world right now. So I think that there's still that self-care part of it. I don't want to like diminish that, but there's also a way. I mean, what I want to avoid, or I want to avoid for myself, and I sort of want to like offer to other people to think about, is we want to have it not be a form of bypassing, where we do it to numb ourselves. So we come off and we don't pay attention to what's going on in the world. And then we retreat into our bubbles of privilege or whatever. Because I think that sometimes, there's this, everyone talks about how religion is the opium of the masses, right? This is like an often quoted famous saying, but I think spirituality can be seen as the opium of the masses, right? Where we just sort of like numb ourselves by doing all these like, deep self-care practices that we think can kind of take us out of responsibility to others and to what's happening. So then there are particular political moment, that's something to sort of think about, like both using these practices if they're ways to recharge and regroup, but also like not letting them numb us to what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I really love about your work is you're not a religious person, but you respect religion. And a lot of times in the West, I'm an elder millennial, so like the least religious generation in American history. And the instinct is always to mock religious communities. The individual seeker is always superior to the inferior, like sort of primitive religious communities.
Yeah.
And I think you take these practices seriously and you have respect for them. And I really appreciate that about your work because, for example, that famous quote from, I think it's Marx, right? Religion is the opium of the masses. Well, right now in this moment, a lot of people are speaking about shame and hell and judgment to, for example, ICE agents. And I think you're starting to understand, well, why do people have those concepts? Well, part of the reason they had those concepts was so there would be a sense of justice. That even if there wouldn't be justice in this world, there'd be justice in the next. So maybe those people who believe those things weren't just stupid. Maybe they provided a role for them, for an ethical framework of a sense of like, where is justice if it's not here? And so again, just the way your work engages with these practices is fun, is playful, but it's also very respectful. And I really enjoy it. And that's part of why I enjoy your Substack too. I wanted to talk about Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I wanted to say that I appreciate that you say that you think that I am really trying to be respectful, because that's what I see among my peer group is sort of that idea of a disrespect for religious communities, because they themselves are not part of them. So they just see them. And it's hard right now, given what's going on politically. There are some very loud religious voices, but they don't speak. I mean, if you think about loud Christian voices, they do not speak for all Christians, right? You can't let the loudest speakers sort of represent the entire tradition. And I think we lose resources for personally. I mean, I think it's disrespectful and you kind of can't understand what's going on with other people and sort of have a generosity to them and a humility to them if you feel that way. But you also, I think, lose out on resources for how to understand the world. And like right now, we have a lot of religious leaders saying, and more than our politically elected officials sort of explaining why what's going on it matters and how we might want to respond to it. I'm as a non-religious person finding a lot of inspiration and hope from religious leaders of communities I'm not part of, and
Yeah.
frameworks for thinking about like, well, how do I make sense of this? Right? Like it's like hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
did a whole podcast on what Pope Leo is doing. So
Yeah.
absolutely, there's a
Yeah.
diversity of religious points of view, and there is also a lot of people on the ground from various faith traditions speaking out about what's happening. For example, in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your chapter on meditation. I used to be
Okay.
a college chaplain, and there was this idea that we could replace religious studies or replace chaplaincy with mindfulness, with meditation, with wellness. And I loved your chapter on meditation because you say we think of meditation as just this kind of safe, neutral thing, but
Yeah.
some people get into meditation and they have a breakdown. Like it's not
Yeah.
always a pleasant experience. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, I also have this experience on my campus, right? Where I start the chapter list where we have like mindfulness was really pushed on students during COVID lockdowns, as if that could like solve, having access to the, I don't know, headspace would solve what students were going through during COVID lockdowns. But then also we have a mindfulness minor now. And so like thinking about like and who's taking that. And it's not like the religious studies kids. It's the kids who are like, a lot of them are business students. It's a way to optimize their like productivity and stuff. And so like, what does that mean in the kind of corporate world? But I mean, I think that you're absolutely right that like mindfulness, I think this is true like of all the practices. We think that they're safe. That's one reason why these things go mainstream. Oh, yoga is safe for everyone. And people actually get injured doing yoga. But these things actually work. Like anything, like any medicine, right? There are going to be side effects for some people, and maybe there's too much of it for some people. And I think that we've forgotten that about mindfulness. I think we just assume we should be mindful in everything. I should be mindfully washing my dishes. I should be mindfully folding my laundry. I should be mindfully parenting. Everything I should be mindful. And then also, like, what does that even mean? It's been so reduced. But if we're talking about like meditation, like if someone's like, okay, I mean by mindfulness, I mean like meditation, and I mean it based on like this sort of like silent, intensive contemplation of this sort of form. Yeah, there are there are a lot of researchers now who are documenting meditation sickness, like adverse effects. It's not anything new, but we tend to overplay the positive effects and underplay those. And there's some things that's as simple as like too much meditation, like I think it's more than like 30 minutes a day can lead to insomnia. Like you're like literally awoke, like you're awakened and you can't get back to sleep kind of thing, right? It's like overly stimulating kind of thing. But again, for like if it's could be a form of meditation that causes you to disassociate from your body in a way that's unhelpful, or causes you to not take yourself out of physically dangerous situations because you're again like meditating enough so much that you're like, oh, this, whatever, this will pass, is outside my control. So I think that there's like a range of sort of adverse effects that researchers are starting to, I don't know, just basically track now. And I mean, researchers like in the therapeutic space too, right? These are like most of the time they're sort of like in that sort of counseling psychiatry sort of space. And I just think people should know about that. Again, I want people to know what they're getting themselves into, so they make sure they're picking a practice that's right for them. I mean, there's also this the very basic thing. I may talk about this a little bit in the chapter that like if you're interested in say Buddhist meditation is, so the origin of your mindfulness practice, you should know a little bit about like what the Buddhist worldview entails. And again, make sure there's not some things about your own worldview, maybe your secular worldview, that don't align with that. So you start to like do a practice just like yoga that starts to change you and remake you in a way that you're like, whoa, now I like feel a little schizophrenic here because this is my worldview, but now this is my world. It's just like too much. So a lot of it is, I mean, that's the teacher in me. Like I feel like the more you know, the better. And not sometimes you lean in then and sometimes you lean out. But I think it's always good to do that sort of like, basic research.
Yeah, I think it was a great chapter because you talk about how these practices that were designed for, very advanced Buddhist monks who had given up all their possessions, they'd given up having a family, they'd kind of renounced the world, were just kind of given to a Western audience, and they said like, hey, this will make you more productive or it might reduce your anxiety. And it's like, this is pretty hardcore. I remember I met a priest when I was in college and I asked him to pray for me, and he said, are you sure you want me to do that? And then I kind of realized like, oh, he really believes this could like make me go leave my family and become a nun or something. So when you enter into these practices, having a little bit of understanding of where they come from and being open to the fact that they are profound life hacks and tools, but that they also might transform you in ways that are perhaps sometimes unwanted.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to leave my family and renounce my possessions.
Yeah. Right. Like
You know?
where's the end goal of this? If you're like, what does the end goal of enlightenment look like for you? So I spent some
Yeah.
time at a monastery doing like a silent retreat, and I was like, I am not interested in your form of enlightenment for myself. I do not want to retreat from the world and my family. Like this is I'm not don't want to be on the fast track to this. This is not for me. And even that like idea that like, I mean, you just gave a nice sort of like overview of the history. Meditation wasn't, if you stick with like Buddhism, meditation wasn't even a practice that like monks really did that much. That's also kind of like a semi-recent invention. And then the fact that like laity would do it and then like non-Buddhists would do it. And I think that there's like this desire, and I get this desire to like find the authentic, the real practice. And that's a very romantic understanding of how these practice, like there is like no there to get to. Like these practices are always in flux and always interacting with like colonialism and capitalism or whatever. Like there's, so instead of worrying about that, just trying to understand as much as possible about the practice, like the origins of practice that you're doing, but also like the teacher who's teaching it too, like how do they see it, right? I mean, I think the teacher, I did a Substack about this too. The real importance of finding the right teacher and the right guide, like not like necessarily a teacher like me, but maybe a teacher like me, maybe a professor, but also like if really understanding how they're putting it into a community or tradition, so that you understand at least one view into how this practice, like, its history and its importance. But I think it's not like when I talk about this stuff in public, usually the first question is like, can I do yoga? Like, or what's the right way to do yoga? And I just like, I wish I could give you like, here's a list, a checklist, check off, but it's not really how it works. I really think that a lot of this is like, learning more, being really aware, and then it's not a one size fits all. It's really a calculus that we all kind of have to do about like you're saying, like what's working for you. As I don't like the term life hack because I always feel like people think it's a shortcut, but like what's a practice that's working for you and you're in your life, and how could you deepen it? Or why is it working for you? Like why are you drawn to it? I think these questions are just always important to be asking ourselves, who is it helping? Who is it? Is it really individualistic? Do I have a community? Is it, what circle, like if it's me, my community, the world, like how is it reshaping a better future for other people? Is it just for me? Is it withdrawing? All these questions are just questions that kind of come up. I don't have any answers to, but they're just questions that come up for me. And I kind of like offer them to you guys, to the reader.
I mean, your reporting is so excellent. I wrote a book on Catholic practices and I wanted people to just try them out. But I think at the same time, what you're saying with whether it's a wellness practice or a religious practice is yes, try it out. There's so much wisdom and benefit to many of these practices, some of it scientifically documented. But also, I love the honesty of your book where you say, high control, corruption, hypocrisy, those can happen in any religion or in no religion. You could have a really charismatic leader who's a really good person or not such a great person in the wellness space or in the religious space. And so kind of that trusting your gut and finding a good teacher that you trust is important in any spiritual or religious context.
Yeah. I think we think if it's, I think if we think if it's not religion, like all religion has a PR problem, I say, but for good reason, right? Institutions have done people harm and violence, religious leaders have as well. And I think those of us who are outside religious traditions sometimes think, well, if it's not a religious leader, if it's not part of a religious institution, it's safer because I'm choosing it and I can opt out at any time. But those same forms of abuse happen in the spiritual community, the wellness community as well. Like, we are, if it's everything from like, I just got convinced to buy a supplement that I didn't need, right? To having a spiritual leader who was also sort of doing some of these things that like religious leaders have done harmfully in the community. So yeah, I think it doesn't get you off the hook if you're if the thing you're interested in is somehow getting labeled as non-religious. Like you still have to really do your research and make sure you're doing something that is safe for you.
Right, 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 right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the chapter on sound baths because I went to a
Mm.
sound bath and the name sound bath, I thought like, oh, this is going to be so relaxing. And I
Yeah.
felt incredibly anxious.
Did
It
you?
was so stressful.
Where did you go to it? Like, what kind of stuff did they
I,
play?
I went at my yoga studio
Yeah.
and I think I thought it was going to be like harps or something. And
Yeah.
the vibrations of my body made me feel like I wanted to like fight or flight, like leave.
Yeah.
And so I loved that you talked about that is like it's different people react to things in different ways. Because the person that I went with was completely blissed out,
Yeah.
restful. And I felt like, wow, this is a hard sound. I don't know.
Yeah, I did this, like, I call it my gong crawl throughout, like, New York City subculture. There's a pretty serious sound subculture, sound bath subculture there. So I had, like, a guide who was really into it, and she was with me for most of them, and she was, like, really enjoying them, and I was like, "Whoa, it was a lot for me, I think partly because, I wasn't sure how to listen, and I think I had been told or I had, like, read, like, "Oh, sound baths are great. They're, like, the easiest meditation you can do because they're passive. You just lay there and, like, whoever's playing the gong or the crystal balls does the work." And that's not wasn't my experience. I felt like, whoa, I really am reacting to this in a way, and I wish I knew how to react or listen better. And I think that was my takeaway from the sound bath sort of research was like, I'm not a good listener. Like I
Mhm.
haven't been trained by, and I believe a sound bath worked better for my friend because she's like done so many of them. She's trained to sort of listen in this meditative way. It's like a really important part of her spiritual practice. I don't know how to listen that way. I like my noise canceling headphones. I like don't like to listen. I like it quiet. I sleep with earplugs. Like I don't like because like look, or forbid my like partner breathes. I'm like, oh my God, you're breathing. Like, whatever. Like I don't want the world is loud. We're like taught to shut things out, not to listen. So that's part of it. And then also I think this like fear, although we might talk about more about fear with the last chapter, but this fear of like the fighter, like this is bringing up some stuff. This is not just like soothing and relaxing.
Mhm.
And that was sort of what I learned from thinking about like kirtan, for example, in the Sikhi tradition, that like all those emotions, that's what people are taught to like lean into, like the quote unquote bad ones too, right? It's not just about good vibes and coming out and feeling like happy and bliss, but like really using the sound to develop emotional intelligence across the range. And I hadn't even thought about that as a way that sacred sound could affect me and could be a training mechanism, like make me a better, like make me more emotionally intelligent even, right? So there's that whole piece of it. Yeah, I was not a good listener. I didn't know what I was doing. I just kind of like held on for dear life, kind of like, okay, is it an hour? It was over quite yet. And then
Yeah.
interestingly, the things that I liked the best, and I wonder if this would be true for you, the ones I liked the best were because it was sound that I was more familiar with. So when I
Mhm.
went to a sound bath in a church, and it was combined with evening song sort of liturgy, which is not a liturgy I know very well, but like it involved like sort of like church music in a way that like was familiar to me. I responded differently to that. Or whenever there's a collective sort of like singing, whether or not it's an Om in a yoga class, like I don't like Namaste, but I like an Om. I enjoy it.
Yeah, me
Or
too.
any sort of like hymn or singing, I respond to that. And I don't know if that's partly because of my training,
Mhm.
like in terms of like my own sort of upbringing, but like the for me it was like, these metal Tibetan bowls, they just like the waves of the sound were nothing. I had nothing to hold on to. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to listen and to be in the moment really.
I love that chapter. Can I tell about the metal bowls? Do you mind, or do you want me
Yeah,
to
yeah.
share?
No, no.
It's a great story. Is that we have these singing bowls, Himalayan singing bowls. Most of us are probably familiar
Tibetan
with
singing
them.
bowls. Yep, yep.
And it may be the case that they don't trace back to anything, right? So some of it is also entrepreneurial, has always been related to religion, is that Tibetans would sell these bowls to Westerners and they were just regular cooking bowls. I love that story.
So this is a good story because it goes back to that idea of like we're trying to get like back to that authentic thing, and like maybe that's not really the point. So like yeah, Tibetan singing bowls. You think about these metal bowls, which when I went to sound baths, a lot of people were playing those. They weren't traditionally sacred objects in the Tibetan setting, and we're not really sure exactly what happened. But one idea is that like Tibetans were like sold them to Westerners who came over, like, and they're just like food bowls traditionally. Like there are devotional like bells, there are like musical things, but like it's not that bowl that we're seeing that we now people import. And now they do have a sacred meaning now. Like we sort of given them a sacred meaning. So I don't want to be like they're fake, they don't work, but like
Right.
it's not because it traces back to some ancient lineage, right? So like when I mean like figure out the lineage, I like when I go to like a sound bath, like who is this person who's doing it? How does she understand how it's working? What does she understand? Like, what's her vision of cosmology and metaphysics? Do I like buy in? Is this like when, she's talking about reorganizing the water? I'm like, okay, this is like not working for me, whatever it is, understanding the practitioner who's like giving it to you, understanding the leader who's giving it to like how they fit it in. Not that I'm trying to trace back to some original there, because there's no there.
Right.
And I love it. I think people don't know that the Tibetan singing bowls. And again, it doesn't mean that they're not sacred or they don't work. It is fine that they like cost a lot of money now, and that they've been sort of given them the sense of spirituality. I don't mind when things get commodified. Really, I think everything gets commodified. Religion, quote unquote, religion gets commodified too. It doesn't make it less religious, but it does. It just is something to be aware of, right? Like, yeah. It
there's
is kind of
a
a funny
huge
story.
market, like in the Middle Ages, for the relics of saints, and most of
Yeah.
them were animal bones. That doesn't mean they weren't meaningful to people. It's just kind of funny and interesting to know that.
Yeah, like when
And
you
the
watch
messiness.
I love the messiness. Like that's my favorite part. I'm not afraid of the messiness because I don't mind sitting in the space of ambiguity and discomfort because I find it very productive. Like, but like relics is a good example, right? So when we're walking the community of my students in northern Spain, we come across some churches that have lots of relics, or I think we see 3 holy grails or something, but it doesn't really matter whether or not that like this is the finger of Christ or this is the thorn from, for me, it doesn't really matter from the thorn from Christ's, crown. What's interesting to me is like all the pilgrims standing in line to see this thorn and why and what are they, what is it, why is it meaningful to them now and what is that meaning? So I'm always interested in like sort of like the community around it, and the meaning making that people attribute to things. So yeah, I like the messiness. The messiness is fun.
I did too. All right, I want to get to just a little bit more and then we'll wrap it up. I know you have things to do, but the ayahuasca ceremony chapter, I have to admit, it was a little bit scary. It was a little bit intense. Psychedelics, I think of this history is fascinating right here. A lot of people don't know. Here's where conservative and liberal come together, are protected because of the First Amendment and actually the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. They can be part of religious ceremonies. So you went and participated in one of these ceremonies. Like, what was your takeaway?
So let me also say this chapter also scared me. So there are 7 practices in this book and I was on board, and there were more originally, right? I had to kind of narrow it down to 7. I was on board for doing all of them. Like I like leaned in on all of them, except for this chapter. I don't drink. Psychedelics are not my thing. There's a great story about me in college eating a pot brownie by mistake. Like it's just not my vibe. And I convinced myself and my research assistants, God bless my research assistants at Northeastern. So my students were like, oh yeah, you don't have to do psychedelics. You can just, and they convinced me I could just like go and like interview people and, observe. And I got convinced by someone that was not true. I got a couple of things that have happened. I mean, this is just like, serendipity, I guess. But like, I met with John Lattin, who is author of a wonderful book called The Harvard Psychedelic Club that talks about the sort of LSD experiments in Harvard. And sort of like really, really interesting sort of cast of characters. And he's done a lot of work on religion, psychedelics. He's written a couple books about it. He kind of knows the whole history. And so he and I had lunch, and I was trying to figure out like which community I was going to go observe and interview. And I sort of had this like, ones that are very established, like a Christian community, a Jewish community. How do they use these in terms of their, deepening of mystical experiences, right? That was my plan to go into these communities and interview the leaders or whatever. And he's like, yeah, that's not what you want. I think you're interested in what your questions are really like, how does the container of religion change how you take a psychedelic, right? So for me, I'm of the Nancy Reagan era, don't do drugs. So like if a psychedelic is a drug, not interested. If a psychedelic is medicine, say like an indigenous sort of setting, I'm more interested. But what would it mean to have psychedelic be a sacrament? And he's like, if you want to look at religion as psychedelic as a sacrament, this is the community that you want. You want the Santo Daime community. They're a religion that takes ayahuasca as their sacrament. They're this, they start in Brazil. They're kind of a mashup of Catholicism and Afro spiritualism. And, that's who you want to to observe. And I'm sure you could just go and observe, maybe microdose a little bit. And I was like, all right. So I like called the leader. We had the Zoom call. And in this call, we hit it off. And these things just kind of fell in line where like I had lived in Brazil when I was a teenager. It was the exact same year that he was discovering this religion. We had this sort of commonality of like Brazil. I understand Portuguese a little bit. I really trusted him. He like gives off a very trustworthy vibe. Again, I'm like, don't want to take anything. He's like, yeah, you come in 6 months, come and observe. He's like, or you could come next week. We just have an opening. I was like, oh, that's so funny. I had this research trip planned and I can't go now because I'm going to the monastery later. And he's like, no. You want to know what I think? And I was like, yeah, tell me what you think. He's like, I think you should come next week. And I was like, what? He's like, I think you should come next week. You should sit in ceremony for 3 days. And that's what you should do. And I think because it happened so quick, I was like, okay, I'll come. And I like hung up the phone and bought my plane tickets and bought a bunch of white clothing. And I was, within 24 hours, the whole trip was planned. And then my partner is like, what? Because he knows me. He's like, you're really gonna? I was like, don't say anything. Don't say anything to me. I just want to go. I don't want to have a bad experience. Like, don't scare me. And like, 7 days later, I'm sitting in the forest outside Ashland, Oregon, in a yurt. I sat in ceremony with this community for 3 days. They take ayahuasca 3 times a day. I was panicked. I was hysterically crying before I took the first serving. And I don't like to be out of control. And I want to see what's happening, but I don't want to like go through I didn't have anything I was trying to like try. Everything about it was overwhelming. And it's my favorite chapter. And I think I learned the most in it. I didn't learn as much as I could have because I couldn't quite get there with accepting it was a sacrament. Like I could see that it was a sacrament for this community, but I myself couldn't see it as a way that I was communing with the divine. But I took a step there, right? But it was fascinating on so many levels. One is this community is a community that believes in channeling spirits and spirit possession, which I know about and I love. There you go. There's some mess of religion, right? I've like studied this. I've never seen it. I've never been in a space where it's happening. And I was for 3 days. And when you're altered on ayahuasca and the person next to you thinks they're channeling a spirit, you also think they're channeling a spirit. So it was like this very intense sort of like way to observe that. And I'm back and forth between trying to have a scholar head and trying to be in the moment. And, there was like Portuguese hymns, which felt very familiar to me, given that I have a lot of it's like some Catholic feeling liturgy that I was sort of familiar with. Really, really, really incredible experience. I felt like very taken care of. Completely, my whole nervous system took like 4 days to recover from it. And not my thing that I want to do regularly, but it was really, for me, what I took away from that was like this religious container is the only way I could ever imagine doing something like this. Because I did feel very safe. I was like, this is a community that takes this very seriously. They are not here partying. They are not here. This is not a retreat, in Peru in the jungle where I'm worried about something happening to me. There are guardians here. There are people whose job it is to watch everybody. Hold your hair if you go outside and have to throw up or whatever, follow you to the bathroom if you need to, have some, making sure that you're okay. We don't eat during the day, but if you need to have a snack, it would help you with that kind of thing. I felt very cared for, and I felt like if I understood more, like if I understood the hymns more, they would have helped me ride the wave more. I would have been less fearful. Like the dosage I took was very small comparatively to other people were taking. I would have maybe felt more comfortable taking more. Maybe would have gone in with something more that I wanted to process instead of being like, I'm just here to observe. Anyway, it was incredible. It is a scary experience. I mean, it was the hardest research I've ever done. And I've done some kind of crazy crazy research. But it was hard. I think it's sort of like, it's important to have in the book because it's one that I think a lot of people are drawn to. I think certainly in my lifetime, psychedelics are going to be, legalized in a way that, and I think that there are a lot of resources of how to mitigate risk in the ways that different communities have used different forms of psychedelics. And ayahuasca is like, in some ways very extreme in terms of like its effects on you. But so Jonathan Goldman, who runs that community, is also part of it's like an advisory group that's helping set protocol for the state of Oregon for using psilocybin in sort of like clinical settings because it's legal to use it there. And he was saying, we had an incident, I guess it's an incident, on the first day in the yurt where somebody was channeling a spirit and the spirit wouldn't leave. And so it was very dramatic. And he referred to it afterwards as like an exorcism. It was very quick, but it was very dramatic. And he said if that had happened in a clinical setting, we would have had to call the police, and she would have been put on a psychiatric hold for like whatever 24 hours or mandatory but within that ceremonial setting, it was all over in 5 minutes. So really understanding the ways in which that container changes the experience, it also makes the experience safer, really made me think about like, we really need to have more of these traditional and religious voices at the table when we're thinking about medicalizing psychedelics. Like when we did mindfulness, right? Mindfulness now got totally medicalized. Hospitals everywhere are great. We're going to do that with psychedelics too. I really hope that we have more of these voices that have used these substances for a longer period of time for different forms of meaning making, know what can go wrong, what can go right, how the container can help shape it for people. Cause there's just like so much like wisdom there. Yeah. It's a crazy chapter though.
Yeah, it's a crazy chapter. People need to read the book. I think there's a lot of wisdom there, and there's also a lot of potential for spiritual abuse. So I appreciate you talking about safety and doing all these things the right way. The book is called Beyond Wellness: How Restoring the Religious Roots of Spiritual Practices Can Heal Us. And you can find Liz at, name your Substack for us again, Reimagining Religion.
Yeah, my Substack's Reimagining Religion. I'm also like lizbucar.com is my website, and that has like links to everything, including my social media and the book and stuff. And a couple of things to kind of mention. I'm really active also on Instagram, but Substack is where my writing and my content really starts. That's like where I really pour my heart in, and I do other stuff. But I also just want to mention that the book doesn't come out to April, but I do have a pre-order incentive. So I spent like a lot of time. My publisher was like, make a 1-page worksheet, but instead I made like a 14-page workbook to go with the mindfulness chapter. So if you pre-order, you get access to the mindfulness chapter right away. And this like workbook, which is like 14 pages for you to kind of think through some of these questions yourself, that's not in the book at all, which was really fun to like write and then like design. So I just like want to mention that in case people are like interested in pre-ordering.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your work, and I appreciate you coming on Inner Immigrate, annakeating.substack.com. Thank you guys so much for listening. And I just want to say, I mean, not to take the last word from you, but if restoring the religious roots of spiritual practices can heal us or deepen us, I honestly think restoring the religious roots of religious practices could heal us too. Because Americans love to kind of innovate and create new religions, but the kind of version of Christianity that you might see like an AI generated picture of like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus with an AR-15, that has no resemblance to like historical Christianity at all. It's a totally different thing. And so I think this book is a great like jumping off point for people who want to be seekers and look into their wellness practices. But it might be also a jumping off point for people who want to learn more about historical religions too, so that they can kind of know like, is this like a legitimate representation of this particular religion, or is this a totally new innovation that, in my opinion, doesn't really have anything to do. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think that the more you know, right? It's always beneficial to learn and know more and to be aware of kind of what am I being sold and is it helpful to me or hurtful to others, right?
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. So I thank you so much for your time, Liz. It was great to meet you. Thank you guys for listening.
Thanks.